Hey, all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is a memoir by Leslie Jamison, Splinters, Another Kind of Love Story. So I love this book, and I hated this book. Splinters is divided up into three parts: milk, smoke, and fever. The entire book spans only a couple of years, the birth of Jamison's baby girl up to the beginning toddler years. In those 2 years or less, she covers the demise of her marriage, which leads to her divorce, falling in love again twice, juggling single motherhood with her writing career, and then ends with those dreadful months of lockdown during the pandemic. I will agree with the book jacket. Jamison writes beautiful passages about life and love and sadness and motherhood. Here's one regarding her soon-to-be ex-husband. In therapy a few days later, we talked about my part in things. We'd agree on an amount of time my students would be there, and then I'd broken the agreement. But this wasn't what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about his storming out, about why it felt like everything I did or loved was somehow an offense to him, why I couldn't even have my students over without pissing him off, why he couldn't stay for a second and say hello. I was so righteous that I could barely see his hurt, how invisible he'd felt, like an outsider in his own home. Or I could see his hurt, but was tired of letting it call the shots. His suspicion that my students didn't want him there, that I didn't even want him there, because I had wanted him there. Or at least part of me had. The other part of me was afraid that our tension would be visible. The other part of me was ashamed to realize how much I preferred the version of myself I gave my students to the version of myself I gave to him. So Jamison took a relatively common incident and condenses it into something well-stated, something that we've all understood because we've all done that with at least one relationship in our life. And the passage I just read to you wasn't even one of the more descriptive passages, which are lovely until you get about a third of the way through the book, and then they just get repetitive and verbose. Part of that stems from the structure of the book. With 3 sections, there aren't any chapters. Each segment, or splinter, as the title suggests, is anywhere from a couple of paragraphs to just over a page. The reader will get snapshots, once again, those splinters of Jamison's experiences, and there's very little in the way of cohesiveness. The segments are all over the place. Some go way back in time. Others start to appear chronologically, and then it will skip ahead or backwards again. And the flashbacks, well, Jamison expects us to have read her other books because she brings up a lot without developing much of anything. I'm still not sure I have a good understanding of why she divorced her husband. I know she dealt with anorexia and addiction and apparently some horrible accident that wired her jaw shut, but we never learn anything about much of anything, except we get a ton of details about museums she visits and sculptures she looked at, and we get repetitive information about her baby. We get the tedious information about her book tour and traveling with a baby by herself. Milk appears to be about becoming a new mother, but then not really. Smoke appears to be about the finalization of her divorce and dating again, but then not really. Fever appears to be about being a single parent in lockdown, sick with COVID, which was the shortest section and was the only section that seemed to have a theme, although it was my least favorite. I just have no interest in reading about the pandemic when we just lived through it 4 years ago. I started to think to myself, so what, as I was reading it? And I was getting deeply annoyed, and I couldn't put my finger on why. Taking most of the splinters on their own, I liked them. But reading one after another, it was bothersome. And then Jamison writes about a friendship that feels tense. And things just aren't right between them. So, Kyle had been one of my closest friends for a decade, from novels outlined on our walls, so that night together in the hospital, after my child's birth. But since my separation, I'd sensed a settled chill between us, like a winter bedroom with a window left open. Tonight, I asked her about it directly. She explained that she needed to pull away. There was something upsetting to her about the divorce itself. She worried for my daughter and for C, although she understood why I'd left. But it was more than that. She explained this next part carefully. It was that she felt, in certain ways, fatigued by our friendship. I was always in the midst of some dramatic transformation, getting sober, drinking again, giving up booze for good, breaking up with Dave, getting back together with Dave, breaking up with Dave for good, falling in love with C, getting married, becoming a mother, now getting divorced. I was always either poised at the threshold of some major change or reeling in its aftermath. She said, "It gets exhausting. As she spoke, I nodded, feeling hurt and also recognized. She was generous with me. She told me I'd been there for her too, through novel drafts, breakups, loneliness. But as she spoke, I could only remember the times she'd been there for me. Those long conversations in dark apartments, bringing the mess of myself toward her thoughtful questions, the solidity of her tender intelligence, expecting her to always be solid. Bingo. That's what I felt like when I read this book. Not inspired by the beautiful passages, not encouraged by the relatable experiences, not enlightened by the unfamiliar experiences, just annoyed. Because Jamison doesn't feel authentic to me because she's all about the drama, even when there isn't any in the segment she's talking about. While Jamison presents her warts and all, and I could definitely relate to her perfectionism and disordered eating, there's passages you wonder, why did she include that? What makes this piece so important? Like a jab at her ex-husband's book failing to sell copies, his moments of anger, yet she never fully describes why she got a divorce, and the food. If you eliminated all the food descriptions in this memoir, you lose about 20 pages. I don't read food books for a reason, but every other page had some mention of octopus or dragon fruit or hummus. I don't care. I just don't care. Her expensive lawyer, her museum visits, I just don't care. I hate saying that about a memoir, especially when memoirs are a piece of an author's life story. But I think that's why I stopped caring midway through, simply because I didn't know what this book was about. And without a strong theme, it just became a look at me sort of book. Is it a love story, as the subtitle suggests? Maybe, because Jamison includes many flashbacks of her parents' divorce and then kind of develops her divorce, kind of. And then perhaps the love of a child as a new mother? Maybe, but then why am I getting all the other crap about teaching and traveling and friends and what's on the menu? Since Splinters is Jamison's third book, I doubt such a book would have ever gotten published as anyone's first book. This is the kind of book only an established author can ever get to print because it's not about anything, yet it's certainly not amusing enough to be like Seinfeld. It's like that David Sedaris book I did a Booksmart episode on, one of his later books that just seemed to be about random stuff. Here's what I think happened. Jamison had all these little snippets written about her life, splinters as she calls them, and then just put them all together in a book, even though there isn't any one theme that jumps out. No thread pulling all these splinters together other than the fact that they are Jamison's life and perspective. Taken in small doses, the book is beautifully written and gives you some stuff to think about. Taken as a whole in 262 pages, exhausting and repetitive and induces a lot of eye rolling. And it's unfortunate because there were some exquisite passages. She writes this: "In time, I came to see that our difficult years were just that, years, neither more nor less. They weren't everything. They were part of a longer story that we got to keep living." A powerful statement about life. Jamison does have some good stuff in the book, but as it progresses, you've got to weed out all the fluff, the extensive psychobabble, and the introspection that even Angela Chase from My So-Called Life would roll her eyes at. And towards the end of the book, I don't even think Jamison knows what she's writing about. Here's what she says as she's kind of reflecting on the past couple of years. "The only thing that the ex-philosopher," that was the guy she was dating, "and my ex-husband had in common was that both of them invited me to live in the story of our relationship rather than its daily texture, saving the widower from his grief, saving the ex-philosopher from the vacuum of his finance life. This was one of the lessons I kept learning, the difference between the story of love and the texture of living it, between the story of motherhood and the texture of living it, the story of addiction and the texture of living it, the story of empathy and the texture of living it." Her first two books were on addiction and empathy, so I guess we're supposed to connect the dots ourselves, but Splinters is a separate book. What texture is the book focusing on? But I am a bit of a sourpuss. I will have to admit that. I am so sick of reading memoirs by authors who are from or who live in New York. And I think part of the reason for that is they all start to read the same. The same type of writers seem to live in New York, and all their books all sound the same no matter how different their topics. It's like when the Midwest got hammered with flooding rains, record-breaking rainfall, and then all that rain flowed south in the rivers, flooding towns who didn't even receive the rainfall in the first place, and it barely gets a blip on the news. Nobody cares. Yet if it happened in New York, we'd still be hearing about it. I want to read memoirs by people other than those in New York City because we Midwesterners matter too, and our perspective will be much different than New Yorkers, providing a fresh take on the world in which we live. In fact, after I read Splinters, I started reading another book by a New Yorker, and I stopped reading after about page 40. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't finish it. I cannot read another entitled woman's story from New York. Years ago, I refused to buy any more memoirs written by someone in New York. The problem is so few memoirs are written by non-New Yorkers. So I admit I'm a bit jaded. But maybe what I get irritated with is Jamison doesn't seem to recognize the overall goodness in her life despite her divorce. She travels everywhere, is getting paid for an artsy job, earns enough money to afford expensive lawyers and never-ending therapy, and babysitters wherever she goes, yet she's always complaining about something. Even her addiction, which she has been sober for 13 years, I think she wrote, yet she's still lamenting over it. Same with her eating disorder, some guy named Dave that was apparently in some other book she wrote. I wanted to see the bright spots in the dark, and I didn't get much of that. Yes, she had some pretty paragraphs about her daughter, but sometimes they read a bit over the top. I guess I wanted more Splinters that appreciated life and the people in it to balance out the tragedy and conflict and drama. Overall, the book just made me depressed rather than enlightened. And I'm all for depressing books if there is some purpose behind it, some arc of the narrator. I just didn't see that arc or growth in Splinters. Here's the thing with Splinters. I bet we could all write passages over the course of a year or two about relationships and parenting, work and vacations, visits to museums or shows we watched, then categorize them into 3 chunks, titling them however we wish with little connection to our passages, and put them in a book. We could title our book Snippets or Confetti or Fragments or Remnants or Morsels or even Bubbles. I bet we would all surprise ourselves with how good it turned out. However, would it mean much to a general reader? What would be their purpose for reading it without some central theme? But that's a moot point because only established authors would ever get such a book published. A book that lacks a strong theme with splinters that didn't come from the same tree branch. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.